Good afternoon. My name is Cindy Mazer, and I am the Director for Alternative Dispute Resolution at FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And I'm representing today the Interagency ADR Working Group, and I'm the Chair of the Workplace Conflict Management Section. So on behalf of those two organizations, I want to welcome you here and just take a moment to thank some people. A lot of people have made this possible, but particularly the Department of Energy. Of course, the Department of Justice as well helps us with all our advertising and marketing and setting up flyers and things. But Janet, what is your last name so I can say it right? Freimuth. So thank you, Janet, for all the work that you've done and all the personnel and staff that you've given us to make this possible. And it looks easy, it looks seamless, but a lot of people have done a lot of work. And Victor Voloshin from the EOC, thank you. Pam Pontillo from Department of Energy, and a lot of people from my staff from FEMA have helped to make this possible. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to do next time before we focus on today. We do try to recognize Conflict Resolution Week in October. Some people celebrate that as a day, some people celebrate it as a week, and some people celebrate it as a month. In any case, what we're going to do here at the Department of Energy is have a speaker that you might know, John Settle from Settlement Associates. He's the president of that organization, and he's going to talk to us about one of the most nagging problems I think agencies face today, and that is honest feedback. So the date for that is October 16th. That's a Thursday, noon to 1:30, right here in this auditorium. And that, or is it this auditorium? Anybody know? It's one, okay. We've been going back and forth between two auditoriums, so thanks for your indulgence on that. And that, the exact title is, Where Do You Stand in the Feedback Loop? Make Feedback Work for You. So that's how we're going to celebrate Conflict Resolution Month. So for today, we've got Dr. Samantha Hardy, who's going to talk to us about the melodrama of conflict, from passive victim to active hero. She's written a book on this topic, and she is a professor of an international nature. So let me tell you where she teaches. She is an associate professor of conflict resolution and the director of the conflict resolution programs at James Cook University and adjunct associate professor at Bond University. Both of those are in Australia. And she's visiting associate professor at the University of Tasmania and adjunct professor at the Hong Kong Shuyang University. In addition to that, she's an affiliate scholar at our very own SCAR, School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution here at George Mason. And she's written several books, and one of them is Family Law, Family Life, working with same-sex couples and same-sex parented families. She's a Rotary Peace Fellow, and she is really just well known for her books, her scholarship, and for her training. So we're very, very lucky to have someone of such international dimensions, someone who's incredibly in demand. We have her here for our very own Samantha Hardy. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, the two books that you mentioned, the Family Law, Family Life, and the Melodrama of Conflict, I haven't quite finished either of those yet. Both of them are in progress. There are another two that I have completed, which are very much Australian-focused books. One's called Dispute Resolution in Australia, and the other one's called Mediation for Lawyers. But this is my baby, the Melodrama of Conflict. So as you'll probably tell very quickly as I start talking about it, it's a thing I'm very passionate about. And it's the main thing I'm working on at the moment. I'm visiting SCAR, and in particular the Centre for Narrative and Conflict Resolution, for 2 months. And my main task while I'm here, apart from doing some teaching and having some very stimulating conversations, is to finish this book. This book has kind of been a lifetime work. It stemmed from my doctoral research over 10 years ago, and it's developing and developing, and it's like the longest gestation for a book baby ever. But I'm hoping that it will kind of come out into the world in a formal way next year. So I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I want to give you just a very brief background of how I kind of got into this mess. I started out life as a lawyer, so I worked as a lawyer doing litigation work for 5 years. And in the course of that work, I discovered that a very unusual phenomenon, although probably not surprising to most people, was occurring. People would win their case in court, but they never actually felt like they won. You know, their conflict would be resolved, and yet it kind of wasn't resolved. And this started to intrigue me and also trouble me a little bit. And at around about that time, it was 1997, I was doing my Masters of Law. And I did a mediation subject, and we were invited to do some additional training and become accredited as mediators. In Australia at the time, it was a certificate in community mediation, one of the early accreditation processes. And in the course of doing that training, I thought, okay, this is better. There's something about this. I like this a lot more than litigation. And so to the horror of my entire family and friends, I quit my job as a lawyer just as my career was supposedly taking off, and I went back to university and I started PhD studies. And what I looked at in my thesis was how people talked about their conflict, particularly when they went to court, or how they were required to talk about it when they went to court, and whether or not that had any impact on their health outcomes. My instinct from my experience in practice was that people seemed to not do as well as they should have done subsequent to litigation. And there's quite a lot of research about people who get compensation for injury and then a couple of years later have spent all their money and are really miserable and resentful that the system didn't really put them back in the position that they thought they would be put back in as a result of winning their case. So I interviewed a whole lot of people who had potential for suing someone for some kind of injury that they'd received. Not all of them did sue someone. Some of them went to court and some of them didn't. And I interviewed them by just basically asking them to tell me their story. So I put ads around saying, have you suffered an injury? Would you be willing to talk to a researcher about it? So they had no idea that I was a lawyer. Most of them assumed I was a psychologist or some kind of therapist. And I didn't confirm or deny that. And so I recorded their stories. Most of them talked for around about 40 minutes. That seemed to be about the time it took people to tell their stories. A couple of people were a little quicker than that, a couple of people were a lot longer. And I ended up with a really nice collection of stories. And one of the things that I immediately noticed was there were two distinct types of stories. And I couldn't explain the difference. Like instinctively I could tell there were this group of stories that all were kind of the same, even though they had different facts. And there was this other group. And coincidentally at the same time, this is one of those weird serendipitous things that make connections in life. I was studying a subject on French literature, completely left field from law and conflict resolution, but I thought I wanted to do something different, and I was very sneakily doing it at the same time as my PhD. And in my French literature subject, we started studying French melodramatic drama, or melodramatic theatre. And as I started reading these French melodramatic theatre plays or scripts, I was like, this is the story. This is one of the stories. I thought, how weird is that? That these people who are involved in conflict that's not going well for them, or that they feel resentful about, are telling their story just like a French melodramatic play. So that intrigued me, and I started doing a whole lot of analysis of those based around genre and narrative analysis. But then the obvious question was, okay, what's the other genre? And it turned out after some research, and it sounds really weird, the other group were more like the genre of tragedy. Now what might really throw you is the people who were telling their stories in the genre of melodrama were the people who were still caught up in it, who were still unhappy and felt that their conflict was not resolved the way it should be. The people who were happy, who were actually moving on, were the people telling their story in the tragic genre. And it sounds really counterintuitive because we think of tragedy as something that means, I don't know, kind of life sucks and then you die. But actually, when you really look at what the tragic genre stands for, it's so much more than that. There's so much more in it. And the kind of theme of these stories was, yes, something really bad happened to me. And yes, I suffered a lot. And yes, probably someone was to blame. But you know, maybe I had something to do with it as well, if I'm really honest about it. But the turning point was that all of these people got something positive from the experience. It might have been a realisation. It might have been some kind of growth, some kind of change in their life. And I was actually just chatting before the talk. A classic example of somebody who was telling a really terrible story but had this very positive outcome was a fellow who'd been in a very bad car accident. A drink driver had crashed into his vehicle, and his best friend who was in the car with him was killed, and he'd become a paraplegic in the accident and had months and months of therapy, and was now in a wheelchair. And he said to me, you know, I know this is going to sound strange, but it was kind of the best thing that ever happened to me. And I kind of must have, I was trying not to say anything because I didn't want to stop the story, but it was obvious on my face that that wasn't what I was expecting to hear. And he said, so let me kind of explain. I realised a few things. I realised how much my family cared about me and how much they were prepared to do to help me when this happened. I realised who my really good friends were, and you know, people came and spent hours and hours with me for months and months in hospital. And he said, I realised that, I could have died, and I didn't die, so that was a good thing in itself. But it also made me really look at where I was going in my life, and I'd been at uni, but I hadn't really been putting any effort into it. I'd been partying a lot, and it made me realise I could do a lot more with my life, and what a tragedy it really would have been if I had died and not done anything with my life. And he said, you know what the coolest thing is? I am now an Australian wheelchair basketball champion. I'm on the Australian team. I was never going to be on the Australian team for anything before this accident. I wasn't particularly good at anything, but now I am an Australian sports person. So I think that's kind of the classic example. The thing that I can't explain, and I think it's impossible to prove, which came first? It's a chicken and egg question. Did people who were more positive just manage their conflict better because they were more positive kinds of people, and did the opposite happen for the people caught in melodrama? I suspect there's a little bit of that, but I also suspect that there's some things about our culture and our social structures that require us, particularly in court, to tell our stories in a melodramatic way to be taken seriously. So that's kind of a very long background, and I need to keep an eye on the time because I can talk forever. But what I thought I might do just to start off with is show you a very short conflict story. So this is a conflict story from a woman called Angela. She's given me permission to show this, and in fact I've shown it for a couple of years now. And she keeps saying, I keep checking in with her every couple of months saying, is it still okay for me to show it? Can I show it in this context? And she always says, go on, make me famous. And I kind of wonder whether this is the way to get famous, but Now, Angela was a student of mine in my master's program, and I asked a whole lot of graduates of my program a couple of years ago if they would mind coming to me as if I was their conflict coach and just telling me about a conflict they were experiencing, and could I record it. So it is a little bit artificially presented. It's really hard to get a real client with a real conflict and stick a video in front of their face. So it's a little bit artificial, but it's totally unscripted. So I didn't know what she was going to tell me. She hadn't read any of my melodrama stuff. She didn't know anything about it, and she didn't really know why I wanted the video. So as much as possible, it's kind of a natural presentation of the story, and it's a real conflict that she was experiencing. So let's listen to Angela's story, and what I'd like you to do as you're listening is kind of pretend you're literary critics, and you're going to critique the story that she's telling. Is it a good story? Who are the characters in the story? How are they presented in the story? What's the plot? What's the outcome? Or it's kind of an unfinished story, but what's the outcome supposed to be? So I want you to think of it, don't get caught up in the story, but try and see if you can observe the features of the story. It's only about 4 minutes long, so it's not very long.
My name is Angela, and thanks for seeing me today. I'm here because I just have a really bad conflict going on in my life at the moment, and I don't know how to deal with it. It's at my workplace where I'm working right now. I have this colleague of mine who has been in this job for like 25 years, and she knows like in and out of the organization by her fingertips, and she's really good at what she does. And in other circumstances, I would have got along with her perfectly well, but because I'm a newcomer in this role, I just have trouble dealing with her way of thinking. She sees me as a threat, and which is really discomforting, because I don't want to be a threat to anyone, but she believes in experience, and that's why she's been in this job for 25 years. And I am straight out of university. I've got 2 degrees in my hand, and she does not respect that at all, because she thinks that experience weighs more than education. And every day is a constant battle, because I have to prove to her that I'm good in what I'm doing and what I'm going to do, but it's never enough for her. And if I go to her for help, especially regarding my work, she just looks at me and she says, "Oh, don't they teach you at uni? Don't they teach this at uni?" Or if I do something well, which I think is good, she just says, "Oh, is this all they taught you at uni?" And everything has the word university in it, or my degrees in it, and it clearly shows that she sees me as a threat, and it clearly shows that, she's threatened by what I have. But at the same time, she's trying to, make me feel inferior to her, and I don't know how to deal with it, because I'm not here to please everyone, but at the same time, I can't. Waking up in the morning and going to work is a nightmare right now for me, because I don't know how to deal with it. It's not a happy situation for me, and I think she's enjoying it, because every time she says these things to me, she says it with a smirk. And she's the one who did my induction process, and she had to show me this is one of the examples, she had to show me to my desk and where I'll be seated for the rest of the time period of my employment. And the first question she asked me was, "Is this fine for you, or do you want my desk and chair instead? Do you want my office instead?" And I just looked at her and I'm like, how do you react to something like that? You think about all these smart answers to give back, but you don't, because at that moment you're in a horrible situation with this person. And I just stood there looking at her, tongue-tied, didn't know what to say, and I just told her, "It's fine, thank you." I mean, I would have given it back to her, but at that moment I was just tongue-tied. So it's a nightmare. I just don't know what to do. I wish I can get a solution to this, because the only solution I can think of is, quit the job and don't do something which is not making you happy anymore. But do I really have to quit this job for someone who is not worth my time? Or how do I go ahead with this? Because there's absolutely no way I can talk to her about it, because she's just going to be like, she's going to ask me, "What did they teach you at uni, how to deal with all these things?" But I don't know, I'm just helpless here.
She's great, isn't she? All right, so we'll go back to this one. Yeah, okay. So Angela's story is very particular, but it's familiar, right? You hear it. I need to make sure I'm standing in the right spot. You hear it and you think, "I know that kind of story. I've heard that kind of story before." In the workplace, we've heard similar kinds of stories, probably in more personal relationships, and we could kind of translate it to group, organisational, international conflicts at one level. What I'd like to do now is unpack the genre of melodrama a little bit with you and relate it back to some of the attributes of Angela's story. So let's have a look at some aspects of melodrama. So first of all, in classical melodrama, the main character, the protagonist in the story, was the heroine. Now, traditionally she was a young female, But even in the way that the protagonist is presented in conflict stories tends to be a very feminine type of presentation. So let's have a look at some of the attributes of the heroine in melodrama. Her first and most important, in a way, attribute is that she's virtuous. She has to be completely innocent, completely pure, in order to deserve the support from people in power. One of the things that people in conflict do very often is present themselves as the innocent victim. Partly they might make that kind of connection with someone they're asking for help from to build rapport. They want you to kind of like them, so you get on with them and you're more invested in their story. But people don't often tell you, at least not without some probing, things that they might have done that are less than perfect. So they tend to present themselves as the perfect person. I'm a really nice person, I'm a really good colleague, I do my best to work hard and get on with people at work, but this other person has done terrible things to me. So virtue is often the first thing that people kind of establish. In classical melodrama, virtue was very much about sort of chastity and obedience. In modern day conflict scenarios, it's contextual. If it's a workplace conflict, it's about being a good employee, however that might be defined in the organisation. If it's a parental conflict, say over care of children, it might be, the mother is someone who puts the interests of her children before her own, or something like that. There are sort of norms of virtue for people in different situations. So the heroine needs to be virtuous to get sympathy from others and to motivate them to help. Another very feminine attribute, or then they're related, the heroine needs to be passive and helpless. So typically in classical melodrama that just comes in her station in life, but in conflict stories people often present as passive and helpless when it's probably not entirely true. So Angela, in the way she's presented her story, hasn't done anything. All the discussion is about the other person's actions. Angela hasn't really done anything other than we know she's kind of turned up for work and we know she didn't say anything when this other woman made some comments about whether or not she wanted to take her office rather than sit wherever she was meant to sit. So heroines in melodrama are acted upon by other people. They don't actually do very much. They're just kind of bounced around by the villain and eventually saved by the father figure. And I see that presentation a lot with people in conflict. It's not entirely true, but it's the way people will often tell their story. Another interesting thing in melodrama is that the heroine is often actually or metaphorically mute. So things that happen in melodrama that prevent the heroine from kind of standing up for herself or telling people what they need to know to make the situation clear, she's often taken a vow of silence, so she can't say anything because she can't breach her vow, or she's locked up in a deep dark dungeon and no matter how loudly she says anything, no one can hear her because she's in a soundproof environment. Or she has someone supporting her who has vital information that can save her, but they've had their tongue cut out by the villain in a previous scene. So there's this theme of muteness. Now most of my clients haven't had their tongue cut out by the person they're in conflict with, but almost all of them present as I'm not able to talk to them. And it's not I don't want to, or I think it's going to be difficult or uncomfortable. It's presented as I can't. It's not possible. And Angela's words were I was tongue-tied. She thought of things to say, but at that moment she was just tongue-tied. She couldn't say anything. One of the things that I like to do when people say that is to question whether or not they couldn't or whether they made a choice. And you've got to be careful how you do this because you don't want to make it sound like, well, you could have said something. But when people talk about things that they can't do in that kind of context, I will present it back to them as a choice they made. So if I'm talking to Angela about that moment, I'll say, so when she said that thing to you in induction, you chose not to say the horrible things that were in your mind. Tell me a bit about why you made that choice. So I assume it is a choice, and it is a choice. But what it then allows her to do is say, well, I don't want to be rude. Those sorts of things weren't appropriate to say. And then you can kind of give some positive feedback. So that sounds like that was a really good choice to make at the time. And it's a tiny little thing, but highlighting for people who are stuck in this passive role that they have made some choices. Some will be good, some probably not so good, but highlighting the fact that they have made choices gives them, I guess, kind of a psychological willingness to imagine that they can make choices in the future, that they do exist. But people in conflict feel like they haven't had any and they don't have any. And that's a really important hindrance for managing conflict effectively. The heroine in Melodrama needs someone to rescue her. She can't save herself. And that's how a lot of clients present to me, whether they're coming in mediation or they're coming for conflict coaching, they want help. I mean, the reason they're there is because they haven't been able to deal with it themselves, or at least they think they can't deal with it themselves. But often people are appealing to their supporters for the answer. Can you either fix it for me, or can you tell me what to do? So either I can't do it, or I can't think about what I could do. I see that a lot in workplace situations where staff members will expect their supervisor or their manager or their HR department to do something to the other person to make it better. They want to kind of give the responsibility to someone else. Not because they actually think they're absolving themselves of responsibility, but because they feel like they can't do it. They need somebody else to rescue them. It'd be really great if people could rescue us, if people could solve the problems for us, but even when people do intervene, often that has consequences that people don't think through, and there are often other choices they could make. So this issue of choice is a really big one for the heroine. Let's have a look at the villain, the evil villain. Now, one of the things that you might have noticed in Angela's story is we don't even know the other person's name. Right? She never calls her by name. Now, partially that might be her trying to protect her confidentiality because she knows I'm going to use this video, although she probably hadn't thought that through quite that far at the time I was recording it. But even when I'm talking to people in a confidential environment where as much as they can, I feel like they trust me to keep their confidence, people very often don't use the other person's name. It's that person or the bitch or some label that they give them. They very rarely use a name. And part of the reason for that is that naming someone, identifying them as a human, makes it much harder to demonise them. It's a very first step. So the first thing I would do with a client like Angela is say, what's this other person's name? And then I would use her name over and over again. It's a very, very subtle intervention, but it has a significant impact. So if Angela said, and I'm making this up, oh, her name's Georgia, I'd say, okay, so tell me about when you and Georgia were doing this. And what did Georgia say? And when Georgia said that, what did you do? It's a very small thing, but it can make a significant difference. And one of the turning points you tend to notice with clients is when they start using the other person's name. That can often indicate there's a shift going on. So it's a very interesting, subtle but interesting intervention. So the villain is very often depersonalised. They're a stereotype. In Melodrama, we knew the villain as soon as they walk on stage because they've got a deep, dark coat on and a hat, and there's mood music as they stride onto the stage, and they do an evil laugh, and then they tell you all about their evil deeds. So in conflict, often the person who's telling the story will present the other person as the evil villain. And in doing so, we don't need to think very much about what's going on for the other person. The other person does bad deeds because they're a bad person. That's it. That's all we need to know. There's no need to think about why they might be doing that. There's no need to think about how we might be contributing to their behaviour or contributing to not intervening in their behaviour, because we don't need to do that. They're bad, they do bad things. That's all we need to know. In Melodrama, that's all we need to know. We don't need to ask why they might be doing something, what might be motivating them, because that is assumed by the fact that they're a bad person. Villains are active and powerful. So in the melodramatic conflict stories, a lot of focus is on what the other person has done. There's focus on what the impact is on the heroine, how what the villain does makes her suffer, but there's not much about what she does, and there's certainly nothing about the villain's potential suffering or psychological mindset. We focus on what the bad guy does and how much it makes the heroine suffer. The villain's role in melodrama is to upset the status quo. So typically in melodrama, the story starts in an idealised state. So, you know, the heroine's there, if you ever look at this last picture, with flowers. She's probably rescuing small animals who are about to get run over crossing the street, or she's looking after orphan children, or, you know, she's doing something stereotypically pure and, and generous. Then the mood changes, the music changes, the lights get dim, and the villain comes along and upsets things. What the villain does to upset things is somehow challenges the heroine's virtue. So in classical melodrama, the villain might make suggestions that perhaps the heroine who's about to get married isn't a virgin. Scandal, this marriage may not be able to go ahead. Or perhaps it turns out she's an illegitimate child and she's not entitled to this inheritance that supposedly is going to set her up for the future. So he challenges her virtue and the conflict ensues because of that. She suffers because of that. Now, clearly in modern day conflicts, it's usually not that simple, but the challenge to the virtue, it again depends on how virtue is defined in the context. So in a workplace setting, what the villain often does by the villain's behaviour is challenge the presentation of a virtuous employee of the person telling the story. So in Angela's example, what Georgia, we'll call her Georgia because it's too hard to say the person without a name, what Georgia challenges is that Angela is a good and well-educated employee, which is what she values, what she sees as her virtuous attributes in that context. I've got 2 degrees, she's motivated, she's a nice person and she's working hard. And this woman, the evil villain Georgia, is threatening that, is somehow implying that that's not who she is. What happens then in melodrama? So the villain does his evil deeds, challenges the heroine's virtue, and the heroine is put in a situation of suffering where everybody's not too sure if she's virtuous or not. You know, there's questions being asked. Then what happens, luckily, the father figure comes along. So in melodrama, the heroine is always dependent on a father figure. It might be her actual father, it might be a guardian, it might be a king or a military ruler, but traditionally it's a man with fairly high status and power who she's dependent on. The father figure's role is to put things back the way they should be, is to identify that the villain is evil and hence his deeds are evil. He has made the heroine suffer unjustly and he implements what's known as dream justice. The villain gets his comeuppance. The heroine is not exactly rewarded but kind of compensated for her suffering in some way, and everything goes back to the way it should be. So we go back to a scene at the end that looks very much like the scene at the beginning, where she's back with the animals and the orphans and the sun's out again and everybody's happy. So one of the things that's really problematic about the melodramatic narrative is firstly that it idealises the past. It motivates us to present the past as perfect because the more perfect the past is before the villain comes along, the worse it looks when the villain messes with it. So you'll see this kind of thing in the injury litigation cases. I'll have had people in the melodramatic story pile who would say, oh, since the accident, I can't do housework, you know, and I just feel like, I mean, how bad is it that I can't even vacuum the house? I mean, it's terrible. I just feel like I'm not a good wife and mother anymore because I can't vacuum the house. And, you know, I really wish I could vacuum the house again. Okay, maybe that was really something that she got a lot of pleasure out of before the accident, but I suspect it's an idealised version of how she felt about housework back then. I suspect back then she would have been really glad not to have to do it, you know, except that it seems to have been forced on her in some way, and now it seems to impinge on her virtue as a good wife and mother. So firstly, it incentivises us to idealise the past. The second problem is that dream justice, everything going back to the way it was, is such a fantasy. Even if, in theory, we can place everyone back in the position where they were before the villain came along, there's still memory of what happened. There's still other people who've observed what's happened. There's still some festering resentment in there at some level, I'm sure. So nothing ever does go back to the way it was before. The third and probably the most significant problem about this dream justice is that it precludes any improvement. Like, it's all about going backwards. It's not about moving forwards. It's not about developing a better working relationship or about learning something and growing. It's not about improving our conflict management skills, our understanding of one another, improving the situation for young unmarried women who rely on their guardians for their well-being in society. You know, it's really narrowly focused on two individuals, individual blame, and going back to the way things should have been. So there's no room for growth, development, change, improvement. Am I going for time? It's not too bad. Now, this is my favourite character in Melodrama. In Melodrama, there is a bumbling hero. So he's kind of a hero, but he's not very effective. So he is totally devoted to the heroine. And he spends a lot of time on stage talking about the heroine's virtue, about how wonderful she is. He's usually in love with her, but not always. Occasionally where you have a male heroine, it might be his best friend who's, you know, really thinks he's a great bloke. So he's totally devoted to the heroine, but he's practically useless. So he bumbles around trying to look after her, trying to make her feel better, but he kind of walks past this. I've got a different version of this photo, but I haven't put it up there, where he's looking at the photo and behind him the villain's tying the heroine to the railway track. And he doesn't notice. He's so besotted by the photo going, oh, she's so beautiful, she's so virtuous, that he totally misses seeing the fact that she's in trouble and maybe he could do something to help. Now, the bumbling hero makes the heroine feel good, right? If she's locked in a dungeon way away from everybody and she's all by herself, she's going to really, really suffer. But if she's locked in the dungeon and the hero's there, she feels a little bit better. And she's got someone to talk to. So you never know, she might actually figure something out that she's not going to if she's sitting there wallowing in the dark by herself. So the hero can be helpful in some respects, but he doesn't solve the problem. He might create an environment where solving the problem might be more possible, but he doesn't do it because he's kind of clumsy and sometimes he makes things worse in his attempts to make things better because he never really understands what's going on. When he does try and intervene, he often makes things worse. And the father figure will eventually come in and sort it out. So in the end, it works out okay. Now, this is going to sound a bit wacky, but when I'm coaching clients in conflict, that's who I want to be. I want to be their bumbling hero. I don't want to be their father figure. They will often kind of try and cast me in that role. They want me to give them advice or save them or do something that they can't do to make it better. And I always resist that and I try and be their bumbling hero. I'm there to make you feel better in this situation. I'm here to give you an opportunity to talk through it. I'm not going to challenge your virtue. I'm going to buy into your virtue. But I'm going to ask lots of questions because I'm not really sure what's going on and I'm trying to figure it out. And in doing so, I might help her, my client, understand a little more about what's going on by the bumbly questions I ask, but I'm not actually practically able to do anything to help her. But I can set up an environment where she might figure things out by herself. So that's kind of the role I'm looking for when I'm the bumbling hero. The plot in Melodrama is sensational, okay? And we, even in a kind of inane type of conflict that we saw with Angela, she sensationalised it. It's a constant battle. It's a nightmare right now. You know, she used very sensational language. And she used words like always, every time, you know, this grand overstatements. That's pretty typical for people in conflict. The reality is probably more complex, but we use that kind of language when we're caught up in this narrative. There are giant leaps and plot twists. If we actually did a chronology of the things that Angela talked about, there's big holes in the story. And some of the things that happen just don't kind of make sense. Like, why would this woman at induction make that statement? Like, it just seems completely out of the blue. Now, it might be actually completely out of the blue. But there's something going on, there's some other story intersecting with this one that's led her to say that, and it might actually be something that happened in this story that Angela just hasn't talked about that might explain that interaction about maybe you want my desk and chair a little more thoroughly. But in melodrama, because we get caught up, because we like the heroine, we feel sorry for them, and all of the dots seem to line up to, yes, they're a bad person, you're a good person, this should be fixed, we sometimes don't ask questions about those giant plot leaps and inconsistencies. I think I've talked about those other things. I'm going to keep going. Here's the thing. Resolving conflict often ends up as a tragedy, even when we're trying to make it a melodrama. So for the personal injury victims I talked about who won their case, they got their dream justice. The bad guy was punished, had to pay them compensation, and when they left that courtroom, in theory, they were in the position that they were in before the accident happened. For them, it turns out to be a tragedy because it's not what it was cracked up to be. You know, they actually don't feel whole again. They still feel resentful, often because they haven't had a chance to have their say, to participate. They then get their lawyer's bill, and whoa, that's even worse. But the tragedy is, for people who don't even get that far in conflict, people get passive and they wallow in their suffering. They wallow in their passivity, not deliberately, they're not malingering as such, but we get caught up in this kind of story and we desperately wait for someone to save us. The problem is the longer we wait and wait and wait for this dream justice, the more likely it is that things are getting worse, that we're not managing the conflict effectively, and it's probably going to end badly. So we wait for the perfect solution, and ironically, what we get from that is something worse, much worse often than the perfect solution. So even when we get a resolution, it's usually not dream justice, but often we don't. And by waiting for it, we often make things worse. So let's have a little look at tragedy as a genre. How am I going? In tragedy, there are some key kind of elements, I suppose. And one of the things about tragedy, there's a whole lot of debate about how you actually define it. So different people will define it differently, will emphasise certain things. I've picked out some of the main elements in tragedy, but some people might disagree slightly with the combination. In tragedy, the plots are really complicated. You know, there's a whole lot going on. There's a whole lot of paradox and uncertainty, and things are not what they seem, and, you know, good people do bad things, and bad people sometimes turn out to be quite good and well-intentioned. Nothing's black and white, nothing's good or bad, everything's kind of a little bit of both. So they're not as comforting to us because we have to work really hard to figure out what's going on, and that feels uncomfortable because we don't really know is that person good or bad and what's going to happen in the end. They don't make us feel good, but they're probably more realistic. The other thing is the hero in tragedy makes lots of soliloquies, speeches, kind of to the audience, but he's actually kind of speaking to himself. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about this, particularly from a coaching perspective, is what the tragic hero does in tragedy is spend a lot of time talking to himself, trying to figure out how did I get into this mess and what on earth am I going to do now? You know, and that actually is a really productive place to be in conflict. Rather than saying, help, help, this bad person's done things to me and now I'm suffering, someone save me, he's going, no one's going to come and save me, are they? Wow, how did I get into this mess? What on earth happened? And it's engaging kind of in a process of self-reflection, trying to figure out what actually is the story, trying to interrogate all the things that in melodrama we just kind of conveniently skim over. The hero in tragedy has choices. They might not always be good choices. You know, in some respects, Angela, for example, maybe her realistic choices are stay and have this woman continue to be horrible to her, if we take her story on face value, or leave. maybe they really are her two choices. Maybe this person really is horrible and really isn't going to change, and maybe a manager isn't going to step in and save her. Maybe they are actually her two choices. Better that we recognise that than we wait around for some other choice that's not going to occur. But actually for most people there are many, many more choices than that. There are a whole lot of things in between. If leaving is a choice, when do you leave? What are you going to do to set that up? There are a whole lot of things that you can use to make multiple choices, I suppose, for a client. So in tragedy, the hero has choices. That's what makes it hard to be a hero. Because choice is hard. You can't just sit around and wait for someone to make a choice for you. You have to try and figure out which is the right choice to make. Sometimes they make the wrong choice and it ends really badly. In tragic theatre, that's usually what happens. But again, something is saved. So in tragedy, the two audience emotions are pity and fear. We pity the hero because some of the stuff that happens to him is undeserved. We pity him because he's not entirely bad. He's flawed, he's not perfect, but he's not bad. We don't sort of say, well, you deserved it because you're an evil person. We say, yeah, you kind of got yourself into that mess, but I do feel sorry for you because you're kind of a nice guy, right? So we feel pity and we feel fear because this could happen to us. We recognise that this person is not too different from us. We recognise that we too aren't perfect, we too aren't flawed, and at the end of the day, we too probably can't sit around and wait for someone to come and rescue us because real life doesn't work like that. So pity and fear arises, and often the ending in theatrical tragedy is something bad. But the hero learns something from it. And there's this moment of recognition where the hero recognises, wow, I actually did this to myself, or wow, I significantly contributed to this, or there was something I could have done back then that would have maybe taken this in a different path. And maybe it's not going to save him from this particular conflict, this particular situation, but if he survives, you know, if he's able to manage it to a point where he survives and moves on for another story, maybe next time he's learnt something that's going to improve the next conflict he finds himself in. It does sound a little bit still doom and gloom. I guess my role as a coach is to try to work with people before they get to the bit where they're about to die. And, you know, it's great to learn all those things just before you lose your job or, you know, the very bad ending. My hope is with coaching, I get people who are often in the heroine role early enough in the story that I can help them using some of these tragic techniques to develop that story a little more, to recognise choices that they could make and to change the ending. I'm not going to sell them a happy ending. I'm not going to sell them dream justice. It might be possible, but it's one of the possibilities and there are probably others. And this is probably not going to work out perfectly, but let's see what we can do to make it as good as possible, and let's see what we can do to make the downsides a learning experience, something we can develop from and grow. That's the tragic sensibility, this recognition that our fantasy of it's a fair world and justice always happens is just a fantasy. It doesn't mean we shouldn't stop working towards it, but we should have contingency plans for when that's not possible. And we should be prepared to learn from our mistakes, to admit them first and to learn from them. So I see myself as my client comes in as kind of a melodramatic heroine. They try to make me their father figure. And I say, no, I'm just the bumbling kind of hero. No, I'm here for you. I'm totally here for you. And I'm going to sit here and pay 100% attention to you, help you go through this story, and I'm not going to judge you. I might challenge you, but I'm not going to judge you. And what I hope is they then become their own hero. They don't need a hero anymore. They don't need a father figure anymore. They can go out and take an active role in making things better, even if a little bit better for themselves. So that's kind of my philosophy, I guess, in a literary sense. I think I've said all that. Yeah, so I also see myself a little bit as a mirror. Rather than the client telling me the story so I get the story clear and I can tell them what to do, I see myself as someone who enables the client to talk to themselves. I enable them. I'm there so that they don't feel stupid talking to themselves, basically. But I'm facilitating them to engage in a process of self-reflection about their conflict. So I see myself as a little bit of a mirror. Sometimes I might be a mirror with some harsh lighting, and I might sort of help them look at things that maybe they're avoiding looking at. But my job is to get them to start having a conversation with themselves. I'm just facilitating that. I'm going to give you sort of some practical tips now, like some practical things that I do to try and make that happen. And these are kind of in a bit of a random order, but hopefully you'll see the connection to what we talked about. The first thing I do is I ask the client to set a goal. I ask them what they want to get out of the conversation with me. Now that's standard practice. Most coaching models have that as your first step. But it actually is a really important step in the client taking some responsibility for working towards a solution. Asking them where they want to go is a very different question to what they want to get back or what they want to go away. And it's actually really hard for clients to do that. They learn after a session or two what it means and they get the hang of it, but often for people who are stuck in that heroine role, the thought of making a choice of where they want to go isn't even on their radar. And people can really struggle with that question, so you have to support them to do that, and it can be quite a challenging experience. Personalise the villain. A very simple task that I've already mentioned is just to use their name over and over again whenever I talk about them. Not artificially, but instead of saying he or she or whatever, I say their name over and over again. I help the client to complexify characters and plot, and I do that by being the confused hero, asking a whole lot of questions. So, I don't understand. So she said that to you in induction. That's really weird. Tell me, why did she say that? What made her say that? Like, what do you think was going on there? Just asking for more information. So one of the metaphors I use with my students, I say people in conflict come to me and they tell me this story, and it's like stepping stone here, giant leap, stepping stone here, giant leap, stepping stone here. And I say, let's go right back to the beginning. Okay, before we go there, tell me what's around. You know, I get them to slow down and look around. And I said, well, what was going on then? What was going on over here? And who else was around? Were there other people there? Tell me about what they were doing. So it's about slowing them down and getting them to look around. And sometimes when they do, they see pathways or information that isn't between evil villain and someone rescuing me. There are other ways to get places that might be better than being stuck on this path to nowhere kind of. So lots of naive questioning. I ask for a lot of details about the client's actions because often they don't tell me that. And what did you do then? And often when I ask that question, I get an impact answer. It was awful, I felt so bad, I was so upset. And what did you do? People just really avoid that question. Again, I don't think that they're deliberately deceiving me. It's just not on their radar. It just doesn't fit in their kind of story, the story that they've adopted. I ask a lot about the history. In melodrama, the story starts with the victim, the bad guy doing something bad. But there's usually some history. So I always ask about a time before the first bad incident. So in Angela's case, first incident is the induction, the comments about, do you want my desk and chair? I'll say, tell me a bit about how you got this job. Because there's probably something there that might explain why this conversation happened. I ask about other characters. Who else works in the organisation? Tell me about, you know, your relationship with them. Tell me what you observe in their relationships with Georgia. You know, I want to get other people in. I want people to realise that it's not just them and the villain and the father figure. There are other people around who are contributing, observing, having some sort of input on the situation. In terms of characters, you can think more broadly than people too. There are structural and systemic things going on around the characters that can constrain what they might or might not feel possible. So I will ask things about, I don't know if it's a conflict with a supervisor or a subordinate, what performance management systems are there, or you know how you relate, how the roster system works, or something. That I'll ask about structural stuff as well, context stuff. I'll try and use non-universal language. So where the client says she always says that, I'll try to avoid using words like always. And I'll ask questions about it. So you said she always says that. Give me some examples of when she said that. Okay, and what other kind of conversations do you have to have with her? And I'll keep asking questions until maybe there will be an example where they've had a conversation and she hasn't said that. And it's not to prove her wrong, it's just to let her realise that maybe it's not quite as all or nothing as she's presenting. And you can do it in a way that's not judgmental. You can do it in a way where you're just curious and trying to figure it out and trying to imagine what it's like to be this person in this situation right now, but not saying, surely she doesn't always say that. I mean, there must have been a time, you've got to be really careful about how you go about it. You've got to be naive and supportive and not challenging, because as soon as you challenge, you're one of the villain's henchmen. Maybe you're out to get her too. Maybe you're on their side, not my side, because there's no middle ground here. I'll use a lot of tentative language to explore the villain's actions and motivations. The clients are often very dismissive, but you have to kind of persevere. And there's a whole lot of really theoretical stuff that Sarah Cobb's written, which is really great, about delegitimising the self and then legitimising the other. So translating it into this framework, it's about challenging the heroine's virtue and then potentially increasing the level of virtue for the villain. But you've got to help the client have a good look at themselves first in an environment where you're not criticising them before they're going to be willing to accept that the other person maybe isn't as bad as they think they are. And again, with naive questioning, you can do that in a way that doesn't overtly challenge. Highlight choices, I already talked a little bit about that, past and present. Clients present as not having had choices, but they have made choices. They might have been constrained, but highlighting them. Exploring suffering. A lot of people present this sort of picture of suffering that's very stereotyped, and it's not actually what they're experiencing. So it's not unusual for me to work with a client who talks about how bad the situation is. And when we actually look at it carefully and explore it, they realise it's not really as bad as they're saying. That actually they've kind of built it up into a mountain when it's actually a molehill, and they say, wow, as I talk through this, I think, why am I upset about this? So sitting with their suffering, not saying, oh, get over it, but really getting them to unpack the suffering. What's the impact? Why does this matter to you so much? Get them to, this is probably later on in the process, get them to think about other perspectives, and often ask them to tell me the story from other perspectives. If Georgia was here with me today, what would she say is going on between the two of you? Or if your colleague Fred was here today, what would he say is going on between the two of you? And that can really give people some quite interesting insights and also reinforce that other people are here in this story somewhere. Carefully challenge the notion of dream justice. In a mediation language, we'd say reality testing. Focus on choices and learning. And this last one I think is important, and it's one of the fundamental parts of Naja's and my model. Focus on improvement and artistry. Let's not just get it back to what it used to be. Let's see how you can do better than you think you can. Let's see how you can not just resolve this conflict, let's see how you can improve the relationship that you have with people at work or your conflict management skills. Let's add some value to this, not just get rid of the bad guy and everything will be all right. I'm just going to flick through these because we don't have a lot of time, and you can look at on the website if you want to. But the model that we use that's based on all of this is the real conflict coaching model that Naja Alexander and I developed. The real stands for philosophical underpinnings. The R is for reflection, and for us as coaches and for our clients, we want the process to be about ongoing reflection. In a sense, that's the tragic kind of approach to managing conflict, to self-reflect and learn from that self-reflection and hopefully turn that into some action. But as coaches, that's important for us to continue to reflect on our practice as well. E is for engagement, and again, that's the antidote to passivity in melodrama. We want people to engage, not just for the sake of engaging, not without being careful that it's safe, but not just to be passive, because that's kind of where you're supposed to be in this story. The A is for artistry, so not just going back to the status quo, seeing if you can do better than that, aiming for more than resolution if that's possible, and learning, which I've already talked about quite a lot. And we say the things that we do in our model are we help clients develop the 5 C's, and I think you'll see these are kind of summaries of a lot of the things I've talked about in the melodrama. We help them gain clarity on the situation. We help them comprehend it better, to understand what it all means to them and other people involved. We help them identify choices, past and present and future. We help them develop confidence by giving them a safe space to practice things that they might want to try, to practice saying things in a different way. One of the things clients love is when you say to them, like Angela for example, so you said you would have given it to her, what did you really want to say? Pretend I'm Georgia and just give it to me the way you really wanted to at that moment. And it's so cathartic for people to do that. They love it. And then we usually have a laugh because it's usually funny. And then I say, you know, and if you'd done that, what would have happened? If you had actually said that in that moment, what would have happened? And usually the client will say, yeah, it wouldn't have been a good idea, would it? That's great. So you made the right choice not saying that. What are some different ways that maybe you could have said it that would have been less awful in the moment, but might have been better than saying nothing? And we can unpack that a bit. And in doing so, they practice things. They practice things and they develop some confidence. And then we give them a lot of positive feedback. People in conflict feel like they're not doing anything right and they can't do anything right. But actually they probably have done some things that are pretty good, or that they've tried at least, and so we highlight that. And in doing so, they also learn some skills. So they develop some competence. And we don't teach them as such, but for me, coaching is like just-in-time support. I mean, I can give someone training on conflict management skills. 2 years later, when they're in the middle of the conflict, they might not remember it, or they get caught up and it's kind of a bit late. In a way, the coaching process gives them an opportunity to get some just-in-time support, some personalised, tailored, not exactly training, but kind of elicitative kind of training where we help them figure stuff out. We help them learn from the experience in the moment. And that's much more useful to people. It's much more likely to be implemented if they're going through it, figuring it out in the moment of the conflict, not 2 years before. Just to show you what it looks like, and I don't have time to go through it all in detail, this is what the steps look like. And I probably wouldn't have even bothered having steps, except that if you're trying to teach people, people want to know what they should do first and second and third. It all does kind of blur together, but it's actually fairly natural as well. So we start off with goal setting, as I said. The next thing we do is what happened, and that's where we complexify the story, where it's still from the client's own perspective. We're not challenging, but we complexify the story. We get a whole lot of detail. We fill in as many gaps as we can. We look down all those little paths that we've been ignoring. Then third one is why does it matter, and that's kind of about exploring the client's suffering. You know, what is the impact this is having on you? Let's really talk about it. And it might be things like emotions, identity, power, needs, could be all sorts of things. Then, after we've done all of that from the client's perspective, not trying to say what about other people, just from their perspective, then we get them to think about it from the other person involved, any other people involved, and an independent person. In Angela's case, I might say, if I came in to fix the photocopier one day and I saw the two of you talking to each other, what would I notice? So we get them to think about a stranger observing it. Then we get them to tell us the preferred future, which is often something like dream justice. They will present something like dream justice, and then we explore that a bit and we unravel that a bit to see whether it might be more complex and more possibilities than dream justice. If we end up with something that seems workable to the client, we might do concrete action steps so they have a plan. And then importantly, we do reflection where they go back over the session and they think about what's new for them, what they've learned, anything changed for them, feedback both ways, and we finish. So that's kind of a very crash course on the actual process of implementing some of the kind of concepts that I've talked about. And I think I've gone a little bit over time. But that's my contact details, and that's my US number until the 4th of October, at which time I go back to Australia. But if anyone's got a burning question before then, you feel free to contact me. And now we have some time for questions. Or comments, anything. Anyone? I feel like the teacher in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Anyone? Anyone? People are drooling on their chairs. Yeah, no, I need to wait to get the mic to you because it's being recorded and we need to hear the questions.
What situations do you find this particular framework to be applicable?
Okay. almost all conflict situations, I think. I mean, the areas in which I work primarily are workplace and university. So I have a weird specialty dealing with conflict between doctoral students and their advisors. There's a lot of business there, I tell you. So I use it most often in workplace and in universities, which is kind of a workplace, I suppose. It's being used a lot in Australia, and I'm doing a lot of training in Australia with family mediators who are using this as a separate intervention, often prior to family mediation with separating parents. So it works very effectively there, although there need to be some modifications because you've got vulnerable third parties involved. I don't use it in an international context, but in the conversations I'm having with people at the Centre for Conflict and Narrative in the school at George Mason, it translates very well. I think the analysis side of it translates very well into international conflict. I think it might be a little harder to use as an intervention in that context because of the groups and the logistics. But we've been having some very interesting discussions recently about looking at, for example, the story that's being told about ISIS, you know, fitting that to some of the attributes of melodrama. You know, I think you can use some of those elements and you can see some of them. And it's not for the sake of diagnosing how to solve the conflict, but it's maybe about understanding where people are coming from, why they might be talking about it in that way, and what talking about it in that way does. Because the process of telling the stories in this way has consequences in itself. Irrespective of, if it exists, what's really happening, the process of telling these stories over and over again has consequences in itself. So I think you can apply it to lots of different situations. I, at the moment, am not really certain how you would translate some of the coaching type processes in that context. I don't think it's probably possible, and I know people do it in group facilitation type contexts, but I haven't used it in that context. Sarah Cobb's probably the person to talk to about that. Someone else had a question, yes?
It occurs to me that in any conflict, the person who one individual is claiming is the villain may have a completely different perspective on the situation and may perceive themselves as the victim. When you were doing conflict coaching, do you work with both parties and apply similar rules to address that issue?
I don't, but you can, and I'll try and explain that. Your first point is exactly right. Usually in conflict, the person telling the story is the victim and the other person's the villain. You ask the other person and they're the victim and the other person's the villain. So what you immediately have is competing narratives, competing fight for victimhood, because the person who's the most convincing victim wins. Which, you know, is problematic in itself because it requires people to meet standards of virtue that might not be realistic in order to win. So it already makes things moral when it might not really be a moral conflict. I don't tend to work with both people for a couple of reasons. If I'm working with someone and I want them to feel safe in starting to admit some of their flaws, perhaps starting to feel challenged and uncomfortable and destabilised, I guess, by a story that's been giving them some sort of security, if not resolution, for a while usually, I want them for them to believe that I'm really on their side. It helps if I'm not talking to the other person, because if they know that I'm also talking to the other person, they're suspect already that maybe I'm judging them based on what someone else said. And they will say things like, well, suppose he said this, but this is what's going on. Or if I ask a question, a challenging question, they'll assume I'm asking it because I've got some information from the other person, and maybe I'm actually trying to prove them wrong for the other person. So I find it works better with an individual if I'm not talking to anybody else. And it kind of doesn't matter in a sense because I don't need to know what's really happening. I don't need to know both sides of the story to help this client work with their story and make their story more nuanced, more comprehensive, more understandable, and for them to make choices about how they might choose to behave differently afterwards. It doesn't matter so much. I have, though, and I don't anymore, but I have, and other people do work with both parties to the conflict. I think it still can work quite well. I think it doesn't work as well because of that tension that the person's not really sure you're on their side alone. Having said that, there's nothing to stop you as a mediator using these kind of techniques with two parties in pre-mediation in intake. And they're very useful techniques to use to prepare people for mediation. The difference is when you're doing it in that role, both parties are clear that you're not doing it to be on their side. You're doing it as a neutral or an independent third party. So then they're probably going to be more cautious, but they'll also feel more confident that you're doing it in that role, not on the person's side role. Yeah. We use it a lot. I've done a lot of training with managers and supervisors to coach their staff. So instead of staff coming to them and saying, my colleague's doing this, can you go and punish them for me? Managers have started coaching their subordinates to try and figure out what they can do themselves. There's a tension there because they're not exactly an independent coach. They're not exactly able to not judge the employee. If the employee discloses something that's a duty of care issue for the company or the employer, or the employee decides the really sensible choice for them is to go and do something really bad, the manager has to say, you know what, no. I'm taking this coach hat off and I'm putting the manager hat on, and you're not going to do that. So all of the techniques can be used in different contexts. You just need to be really clear to set up what the relationship is between the two people involved and where the boundaries are. You know, it's like everything, I suppose, like mediation. In its pure form, it works best, but it doesn't mean to say it doesn't have value when those boundaries are not as clear cut. Yeah. Yeah.
We have a question from online. Do you provide coaching services one-on-one, long distance?
I do quite a bit on Skype, which works well when the technology works, but we always have to prepare for the fact that at a very inconvenient moment it might drop out, and then we have to try and figure out how to get in contact again. So yes, I think I like it better when you're sitting with someone face to face. The rapport's better, but Skype these days, if you get a good connection, can almost feel that good. So yes, we've been doing a fair bit of that, which has been going well, but does occasionally have its challenges. Yeah.
I was really struck by your comment a moment ago, I don't need to know what's really happening.
Mm-hmm.
Surely you must have encountered clients who have such an unrealistic view of what's happening that I would think you'd want to have a better understanding of what is really happening so that you could try to help the person pull this apart and see what's really happening.
Yeah. I guess I don't need to know the truth to help them unpack their fallacies. So if a client has a story, I have to take it on face value, but it doesn't mean I'm not going to unpick it to within an inch of its life and challenge every kind of angle of it. If I'm working with the client's story, you can kind of tell when it seems a bit too good to be true, or it doesn't seem like it could be right, but I don't need to know the answer to help them look at their story differently. And I guess my role is not to fix the situation. That's not my role. My role is to give them an opportunity to do better in the situation than they're doing now, which might mean fix it, but there's nothing I can do. So it's different to me being an arbitrator or even a mediator, where I have a little bit of responsibility for trying to move them forward and blending the stories together. But coaching, it's a different purpose. I want to give them an opportunity to go back and have a really good look at what's happened leading up to this situation and really think about different possibilities for moving forward. I'm not there to say, that's not going to work. That's not right. That's not my job. I might ask lots of questions if it doesn't sound like it's right. But yeah, I understand where you're coming from, but it's kind of not the purpose. Yeah, and because I can't actually do anything, I can't make them do anything, it doesn't matter so much. If I knew what the truth was, I'd be much better off in a kind of decision-making role where I'd say, hey, this is what's actually going on, this is clearly what you should do. And that would be great, I'd solve the problem. But I'd solve the problem temporarily, I'd disempower them again by being their father figure and reinforcing their passivity and dependence. And while the problem might be fixed, their story still exists. And they're going to go away with some of those resentments, and the other person's still going to be a villain. And there are consequences longer term. So this is about giving them opportunities to manage it themselves, not me figuring out what's wrong and helping them fix it. It's just a slightly different mind shift.
So
yeah,
I have
Victor, sorry.
There is a follow-up to the long-distance coaching. Besides technology, what are other specific challenges you experience in a long-distance coaching?
Long distance coaching. Look, I think actually technology is probably the only one. As long as you can communicate with the person, I don't know that, I guess where it might become tricky, and this is not so much the long distance, but if there's cultural difference, if there are different cultural norms, that can sometimes be interesting. Although, as a coach, that's a really useful place to be. If I don't understand the cultural context that the client's in, I'm more likely to ask lots of naive questions. The danger is, I guess, that I ask them in a way that's culturally inappropriate. So I have to try and be really sensitive to how I ask about them, but it actually puts me in a really naive kind of inquiring situation. But other than that, the distance doesn't seem to matter so much. It's, in a way, it can be a benefit because I'm less likely to have information about what's really going on, and all I can work with is what the client gives me. And that's kind of counterintuitively what makes the process work so well. I'm working with this person's story, and I'm coming from a mindset where the story is the problem. The story is what's holding them back, not what's really happening. It's their version of what's really happening. That's the problem, not the problem. Yeah. Yeah, I thought that might have helped.
So I have a question. In terms of process, the woman that we saw at the very beginning,
Yep.
what would you be doing there? Would you have weekly 1-hour meetings with her, or what would that look like?
Good question. Okay, so I guess the standard process would be something like 6 sessions, an hour and a half each, over a 12-week period, so an hour and a half every 2 weeks. That would be the kind of standardised package. Now, there's 2 things about that. Leaving a break of a week or 2 can be quite useful because a lot of the work that happens in coaching doesn't happen with them sitting in front of you. It happens in the time afterwards where they go away and think about it a bit more. It's one of the frustrations being a coach compared to being a mediator. You don't see the magic happen in front of you. And you can't, but if they come back again for another session, you often see some of the consequences of the magic. But it's not as immediate. You don't sort of see them shake hands and go to lunch at the end of the mediation. The other thing is that it gives the client a chance to process stuff and try things out. Maybe do a little step towards their action plan and come back and we can review it, they can reflect on it. I think the other thing that's important is I would rarely do more than 6 sessions because inherent in the process is them developing their capacity to manage this on their own. I don't want to become their therapist. I don't want to be the person who's there for the rest of their lives to give them a safe space to whinge to somebody about what's going on. I want to see them get to a point where they don't need me anymore. And after 6 sessions, if they're not managing it themselves, I think they might need some other kind of support. In some circumstances, if it's a very complicated conflict or it's going on over a period of time, it might be longer than that. But generally speaking, most people actually around the 4th session are starting to think, I think I might have this now. But again, the conflicts that I'm dealing with are usually fairly minor, not to the people involved, but objectively fairly minor workplace kind of scenarios. Yeah, often it can be just 1 session. You can just accidentally ask the question that they needed to be asked and the whole thing sorts itself out and off they go and you don't need to see them again. Yeah.
More questions?
Hi, my name is Fakhira. I am Palestinian citizen of Israel, and I'm doing my PhD in conflict analysis and resolution and trying to take your lecture and like proud and think about the conflict that we are for a long time. But I found it fascinating for some of the places. And what might challenge me is all the issue of the past, and the people are so attractive and embrace the past so strong in their stories. So how we can just shift, I mean, this is one of the challenge for me in my studies as well, how we can shift the mindset of the people to think more about the future rather than just embracing the past and this fantasy that we want the past, this is where we want to go back. So what are the challenges there to make this shift in the context of examining or in imagining, which this is part of the things that I guess it's very challenging, but I want to hear your experience in that. Thank you.
I think the key thing is that people, at some deep level, and it's not a conscious level, if objectively, if you get somebody in a good moment where they're not caught up in the emotion of the conflict, they will rationally say, yes, I know that I can't go back to the past, that it's never going to be the same again. But in a conflict situation, somehow we lose that perspective, and we somehow really believe that it's possible. It's really somehow possible to get this dream justice, and that things can go back to the way they were. And I think part of it, and part of the reason I think people default to this melodramatic storytelling in conflict, is that when we're in conflict and we're not managing it well, and we feel like the conflict is taking us over rather than us managing it, we revert to kind of childish behaviours and childish emotions. And melodrama is the genre of fairy tales. It's what we use with young children who don't yet have the capacity to understand complexity, uncertainty, and, you know, to accept the unfairness of life sometimes. So with young children, we tell them these moral tales about, if you're good, you will always be okay. But if you're bad, bad things will happen to you. And that, don't worry, someone is always going to come and save you. You know, as long as you're good, someone's going to come and save you. And I think that mentality, somehow that childish kind of belief comes back to us in conflict, and we lose perspective. We lose all of that stuff. We don't lose it, but we repress it. All of the stuff that's enabled us to recognise things like dream justice doesn't happen. You can never go back to the past. It's never entirely recoverable. I guess I don't really know how to answer your question, other than it's about challenging in a supportive way the possibility that the past can be resurrected. It's firstly about trying to get people to acknowledge that. That can be really hard because people don't want to let go of that. That's a security blanket in a way. And I guess the flip side of that is starting to get people to think about the fact that maybe they can do better than the past. They don't have to let go of it, but they can make it the foundation for something better. Let's see if we can add value to it, which is kind of like saying, let's not go back, let's go forward. But if they can't let go of the past, saying, okay, let's see what we can do with the past to make it better in the future, and then we're doing something more proactive than reactive. Not a very comprehensive answer, but I think the Israel and Palestine dynamics can fit this genre quite well. How you use it with groups like that at such a large scale, I don't know. But it's a great PhD. Maybe you could come up with the solution.
We have another online question. For the coaches who want to use this particular model, as you described it, what additional development and resources would you recommend?
Okay, at the moment there's not a lot out there publicly available. When I finish this book, that will be a really good starting point, so stay tuned. Nadia and I train this model in Australia and in Asia, largely in Hong Kong and Singapore. We've done little bits of training in the States, but because both of us live a long way away, we haven't done very much here. Yeah, get in touch with me, I guess, and I can send you bits and pieces, but yeah, in terms of what's publicly available, not much at the moment, but we're working on it, yeah.
Will you just say a couple things more about how you help someone develop the inner hero?
Yeah. Oh, and this is often a misunderstanding, because the hero in melodrama is quite a different character to the hero in tragedy. So the hero in melodrama is a support figure. He's not a main character. He's just kind of a side figure who bumbles around and makes the heroine feel better. But the hero in tragedy is the main character, is the active hero. So for me, it's about instead of being the passive victim heroine, being the active hero. And it's about taking responsibility. This is from, I think it's from David Copperfield, being the hero of your own life. Not being a victim of your own life or your own conflict story, being the hero of your own story. And actually, it's a question you've got to be careful when and with whom you ask this question in a coaching session, but it's a really nice question to ask them. If you told this story, and in this story you were the hero, what would you be doing? How would you save the day? And it brings the focus back on them. How would you save the day? What would you do? You know, what might you have done differently? What are you going to do from now so that you're the hero? You're the one who saves the day, not the father figure or your manager or the villain who somehow evilly ruins the day instead. So I guess it's really about getting them to take responsibility, getting them to recognise that they can take action, they have taken actions. Not doing anything is a choice. That's something I often confront my clients with. You chose not to do anything. And maybe that's okay, but it's a choice. So getting them to recognise that they do have some control. Probably not as much as they would like, but probably more than they realise and more than they're using. And getting them to engage on that level. Yeah, and I guess that's kind of the philosophy that underpins a lot of this. Rather than waiting for someone else to do something, what can you do? What can you do to make it maybe not perfect, but maybe better? Yeah.
Super. One last question.
I presume that your choice of your words, hero and heroine, was not intended by you to give them masculine and feminine qualities.
Wow.
But I think someone listening to you can't help but hear that in your repeated use of those words.
And it's kind of deliberate because firstly in the classical genres, in melodrama the heroine was always a young female, or if occasionally she was a man, she was a young man who hadn't yet reached manhood. And in tragedy, traditionally the hero was male. But I think what's actually more important is the heroine or the victim role is an inherently or stereotypically feminine one. Passive, dependent, virtuous. In tragedy, it's a more masculine role in that they're active, independent, and maybe not perfect. Because somehow women are supposed to be perfect, men don't have to be perfect. They can be just kind of a rough diamond, and that's cool. And even though it's based on traditional stereotypes, I think the stereotypes still kind of exist, at least of the masculine and the feminine. And one thing actually that this is a little bit of an aside, and I promise I won't go on for too long, most of my voluntary clients, so clients who choose to come to coaching rather than who've been referred by an employer, are women, okay? And I think it's because men find it really challenging to be in that victim role, because not only are they a victim, but they're emasculated. And I think they still tell themselves those stories, but it's kind of not culturally appropriate for a man to tell their story casting themselves in that feminine role. So they might not overtly tell it, they might not ask for support, it just festers inside them. Whereas women, it's a bit more okay to say, I feel helpless, can someone help me? So the gender thing is there, and I think it is there. Partly it's historical and part of the literary genre, but partly it's about what expectations are of action or passivity in not just in conflict but in general. So I think there are some gender issues there as well. Yeah.
Well, I think you know that I told you that I had to leave at 1 o'clock because of another engagement and graduation, but I couldn't leave. And you just did a great job.
Sorry.
Thank you so very much. It's really been great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.